Well, hello and welcome to Dr. Childress Down the Rabbit Hole. I'm starting a series here, uh, potentially evolving into a book, describing my adventures in the family courts, the adventures of a clinical psychologist in the family courts. Um, and so I'm filming these up on uh, YouTube at this point to assist in writing a book regarding the situation in the family courts, or just having it documented in a YouTube series. So I thought I would start that process today by coming on and beginning to describe my adventures in the Wonderland of family courts. So to begin with, just a little background on my background and history. I'm always wanted to be a clinical psychologist. Since high school, I went out and um, uh, got the psychology degree out of UCLA from the get go. I knew I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. I wanted to have a consulting practice like Sigmund Freud or something, where people come and talk to me and we do depth psychology. I thought that would be uh, very interesting for a life career. So I was an undergrad at UCLA. Got my first practicum internship type experience at Suicide Prevention Center in Los Angeles as a telephone crisis counselor, and then moved up shift supervisor and things. And then after graduating from UCLA with a bachelor's in um, psychology, there was a new PsyD degree that had just become available, and that's the one I wanted. I didn't want the research, I didn't want the PhD, I wanted the clinical, and PsyD is clinical. But I wasn't sure if it was going to have the professional standing, and it was a relatively new degree at that point. And so I decided to go and take a master's program. And so I was going to take a master's program, see what happened with a doctorate, and then I would go back to a doctorate program. So I went to Cal State Northridge and took a master's program in clinical community. And it was for the community aspect, which is how to um, organizational development, organizational consulting, as well as how to change community systems to treat pathology. So it's a very interesting thing. But I want to point out, I've actually been trained in how to do what I'm doing in the family courts, change the family courts to treat the pathology. So I know how to do that. I have training in that for my master's degree, how to change community systems to treat a pathology. So, so I got my master's degree, and then after the master's degree, got working in UCLA again. My father's from UCLA, my brothers are from UCLA. I graduated from UCLA, and in the West Side, UCLA, that's a nice place. And so I got my master's degree and got a job on a research project at UCLA on schizophrenia. I intended to stay for like 2 years, and then I was going to go back to the doctorate degree, which was the typical stepping stone for that position. Students come in, work a couple of years, and then go on to the doctorate. But it was a nice job. I was tired of school. I was tired of the master. I was tired of all the jumping through hoops. I was getting relatively good money for a young man, good position, like the people, benefits, all these wonderful things about working at UCLA. I lived right off on Beverly Glen Canyon, this little wooded, like cabin-esque type of thing. I was 5 minutes from UCLA. Boop, just drop in, and there's nice campus atmosphere, and all the activities and lectures and things of campus. And so it was a wonderful time. And I on the 2 year cycle, I looked into graduate school at 2 years, didn't like California School of Professional Psychology. And so I didn't go back to graduate school, intending at some point, but not yet. And I wound up staying like over a decade at UCLA, 12 years, because the people were nice. My wife and I got married up in Yosemite, and we invited the people from the aftercare clinic, so they were at my wedding, Keith Nectarline and Joe Ventura and stuff. They were good friends. And so for 12 years, I was at UCLA working project on schizophrenia, which is where I learned about delusional thought disorders and how to assess them and what they look like. And then, um, and then got married and had my first child, the son. And it was at that point I said, you know what, if I'm going to go back and get a doctorate, I need to do it now. While my kid's little and to take care of things. So I did. I took out a lot of student loans over the course of time, but I went back to Pepperdine and worked half-time at UCLA to maintain my health insurance and went full-time to Pepperdine. I got a doctorate degree and internship at Children's Hospital because I wanted to work children, and then things progressed after that. While I was at Children's Hospital, my interest is the brain. I've always loved how the brain works. I'm a science kind of guy. And so I was we had a neuropsych class at Pepperdine on neuropsychology. I went through that book like nobody's business. I extracted it. And I pretty much know all the brain systems and functions and stuff, okay, at least back then. And then I wanted to work children, and I wanted to work early childhood because that's when the brain is developing. So at Pepperdine, I got hooked up into Shore's work on the neurodevelopment of the brain, affect regulation, and the origins of the self. And I was fascinated by Shore. And that got me linked into Stern, and I was fascinated by Stern and Tronic and what was happening with the brain development in early childhood. And Children's Hospital has an early childhood program through Marie Polson, one of the few ones. And it's a specialty practice, 0 to 5, because you have 0 to 5, you have to understand each of the brain systems: language, emotional, relationship, physiological, cognition, all those brain systems, how they are developing individually, across infancy, 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, then at 18 months, then at 24 months, then at 36. How is each one of those evolving and developing? You have to understand all that if you're going to work early childhood. And you have to understand how they're all going to connect, how the emotional system affects the language system, affects the cognitive system, and how the physical system affects the emotional system, relationship system, attachment, all this kind of stuff. You have to understand how all of that works together. And that's my specialty in attachment. 0 to 5 is the formation of the attachment system. I can tell you exactly how the attachment forms in 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, 48 months, in 5 years. Exactly. All the brain systems, attachment, and intersubjectivity, which is the second relationship system on attachment. So I bring to the family courts both 12 years of experience with delusional thought disorders and early childhood mental health specialization on attachment. I am like one of the best trained people in attachment and delusional thought disorders. Just on the delusional thought disorders, I was trained every year for 12 years to diagnostic reliability with Joseph Ventura and David Lukoff, who were the diagnostic heads at the VA. And every year we were trained on the brief psychiatric rating scale to diagnostic reliability, to the gold standard. And Joseph Ventura and David Lukoff, Keith Nectarline, are the authors of the revised BPRS. So they are the best assessors of schizophrenia symptoms, including delusional thought disorders, because they're doing a major NIMH research on schizophrenia. And so, yeah, getting this diagnosis and the symptoms of schizophrenia is really important for them. So they did a really good job of it. And I'm trained to 90% reliability to the top people who can assess delusional thought disorders: Joe Ventura, David Lukoff, BPRS, for 12 years annually, trained on that. So there's nobody close in the family course, nobody close out in the clinical psychology world who who have received the level of training that I have in the diagnostic assessment of delusional thought disorders. So then I do early childhood mental health. That's the attachment system. And because I'm early childhood, there was a project in Orange County where Jim Swanson, who is the top kahuna in ADHD, that was the other interest of mine, ADHD, and he was one of the top. There's Barkley, there's Connors, but Jim Swanson is right there. All the school-based research on ADHD comes through Jim Swanson's lab. He's heavily involved with the medication industry. They run all their clinical trials through him. He has a non-public school that he does all his research with. The kids get kicked out of public school, and he has a little school, a research school, that they come into with an intensive ADHD treatment program. He was one of the lead sites on the MTA study, which is considered a 6-site study on ADHD and medication, considered the best randomized clinical trial ever conducted on anything. And so we have one of the top guys in ADHD, but he wanted to go early childhood. He wanted to work with the preschoolers because he was getting into brain development, and he had these ideas, Bruce McCandless, others, Porges, others, about how we could remediate the attention networks if we get them early enough, early childhood, 3, 4, 5, preschool age, by using computer games. So we could develop these sets of computer games with the child's playing, and that would build the neural networks for attention. But even though he had, great competence in ADHD, he wasn't competent, and none of his people from the MTA study, none of them were competent in early childhood, 0 to 5, which is a subspecialty domain because you have to understand all the brain stuff. And so even though they are immensely competent with ADHD, they couldn't go early childhood unless they had some early childhood specialization. And so they were collaborating with John Watson, who was at Children's Hospital of Orange County. You know how collaborations get. You have Jim Swanson at UCI Child Development Center collaborating with, CHOC, Children's Hospital of Orange County, and they have this collaboration, and they get grants because Jim Swanson gets grants. Holy cow. So he flexes and he gets grants. And let me explain how powerful that is. So what he wanted to do, Jim, is he wanted to run a pilot program on this training, this using computers for ADHD attention networks with preschoolers. So he wanted a group of preschool age children he could do his pilot study on. Well, how do you get those? What Jim's the way of getting the access to a group of preschoolers to run his pilot program is he set up a county-wide program for parent training for all the preschool age kids, free parent training offered in the community. So we would offer it at church sites or school sites or community centers, libraries, wherever there was a community site out there, we would kind of contract out and go do that. And so he set up this whole network of parent training programs throughout Orange County for parents of 0 to 5 for preschool age kids. And then in addition to that, he hired all this staff, this childcare staff out of UCI, students and stuff. And so he got this childcare staff and would provide free childcare to the parents while they did this 6-week parent training based on a behavioral model, timeouts and planning ahead and response cost, positive reinforcement. And so it'd be a 6-week model developed by Chuck Cunningham in Toronto, McMaster University, this COPE model. The COPE model is based on Socratic questioning. So we would show videotapes of problematic parenting around small group, and that leads small group discussions around a circular table about what went wrong in that parenting. What would you suggest? And so it was very facilitative of, instead of didactic training, it was very active, and we would facilitate through Socratic questioning the learning of these parents about the various curriculum. And so Jim had Chuck Cunningham come down, train all of us, and my role with the project was to oversee the parent training component. So again, because my dissertation was initially on parent training, but using the internet, I read everything about parent training. I know Barkley, I know Steps, I know Webster Stratton, I know Forehand, I know Patterson, I know all the research about parent training. There was no research between up to 1995, 98, nothing. No book, no research that I hadn't read about parent training. So now think about that. I got delusional thought disorders. Nobody's better trained than me. I've got early childhood background. I know how the brain develops spot on attachment. And I've got parent training and parenting skills. I am perfectly set up for the family courts in terms of what I know and my level of experience. It's just super high. And the family courts, forensic psychologists are non-existent. So it makes my head explode what's happening over here because of the ignorance. They just simply don't know anything. To return. So, I'm working with Jim Swanson, helping lead all these groups and stuff, and so that he could get the preschoolers and get access to them. And I was recruited out of Children's Hospital because Marie Polson, I have early childhood background, and so they needed somebody with that. And I'm also interested in ADHD, so I was brought over and headed up that project. Then another project opened for with FEMA and Department of Justice regarding juvenile fire setting in the family courts. So I worked with a forensic psychologist to come up with an assessment protocol for juvenile fire setting behavior in the court system, juvenile court system. And so, again, I'm familiar with coming up with assessment protocols for the courts. I'm working in legal. I'm working with a forensic psychologist. Ken Feynman was the top expert in juvenile fire setting. He just top expert, internationally recognized expert in juvenile fire setting. However, he's a forensic psychologist. He wasn't very linear logical in his thinking. So they brought me on board to come up with the assessment protocol, the clinical psychologist. What's the protocol? So I did all that, and it's an excellent protocol. So I have that, which again is directly relevant to the family courts. I've done this before. I have developed assessment protocols for the courts before. And I have delusional thought disorder, and I have early attachment, and I have, parent training. So you guys need to be listening to me. So then I'm recruited out. And so once I entered Children's Hospital in my training, I never applied for another job. I was recruited out of CHLA over to Jim Swanson's project at UCI Child Development Center. From there, I was recruited onto the clinical director of the FEMA DOJ project. From all that, I was recruited onto the clinical director position for a county-wide assessment and treatment center for children ages 0 to 5 in foster care. So 0 to 5, and my background, I went out and headed up this 3-university assessment and treatment center for children in foster care. And our primary referral source was Department of Children's Services, and our funding was through the County Department of Behavioral Health. So we have Loma Linda providing a faculty and their trainees on occupational therapy. We have University of Redlands providing a faculty and trainees on speech and language. And Cal State, San Bernardino, provided both the clinical staff for the clinic, but also faculty and trainees out of their psychology program. And so, and then I was brought in to oversee the whole thing and to coordinate the treatment, care, diagnosis of everybody with that. And you can imagine if you have that level of county involvement, with 3 universities and Department of Children's Services and county funding through the Department of Behavioral Health. This is a major county project. Everybody's involved in this, and this is a high level thing, and I'm brought in to kind of run it all. So from there, then I started to move into private practice. So I decided I'm getting older. I need to kind of settle myself in. And so I decided to move into private practice. And I was headed towards solving ADHD, and I can still solve that. There's a whole set of seminars I'm going to hopefully develop up on how to treat ADHD and resolve it, fix it. 60 to 70% of what people call ADHD, or the diagnosis of ADHD, is absolutely curable if you know the brain systems and you respond appropriately to it. And so without medication, changing the parenting approach to the child will eliminate the child's symptoms of ADHD. That's what I'm saying. Now, I can tell you how to do that, but I'm busy in the family courts. So as soon as we get done with the family courts, I'll tell you how to fix ADHD, because that's where I was headed. But then as I entered private practice, I got a letter. And so this is how I fell down the rabbit hole. I got a letter from a minors council asking me to submit my vita for a possible family court case. Now, normally, throughout my entire career, nope, I don't work the family courts. Okay, I don't work borderline personality. I don't work suicidality. I know how to do it from suicide prevention. I don't work suicidality. It's too stressful, and borderlines are that. Okay, so don't work borderline personality, and I don't work in the family courts, because that's narcissistic, borderline activated, and they're delusional, and they're very retaliatory, and it's very dangerous. And all clinical psychologists know that. Plus, the involvement of the court will decimate, absolutely prevent any therapy from occurring. So that's known throughout all of clinical psychology, that treatment will be ineffective because of the court's involvement. There's no possibility of effective treatment, and the pathology is narcissistic and borderline. And if you try to get in the way of that, they're going to retaliate against you. So it's dangerous to your license, and you're going to get licensing board complaints, and it's just everybody's fighting, and it's personality pathology. You can't fix it. The parents aren't motivated to do anything, and the court's going to decimate your therapy. So no, clinical psychologists don't work here. If I knew that, I watched. In the 1980s, clinical psychologists left, and you got your forensic psychologist doing custody evaluations, and it kind of went through the clinical field that don't work the family courts because you get in trouble. That the family courts belong to the forensic psychologist. You do not make a custody recommendation. No, you'll lose your license. If you make a custody recommendation without doing a forensic custody evaluation, you'll lose your license or get sanctions on your license. So no, clinical psychologists left, and we were happy to leave. No problem. We got ADHD, autism, school behavior problems, eating disorders, substance abuse. We got more than enough to work with and earn our living in clinical. We don't need the family courts. So we gave the family courts over to the forensic custody evaluators. No problem. And so they took it over. So normally I would get this type of thing, and I just, nope, ain't gonna send my vita for that. But this time I'm older, I'm entering private practice, and I'm curious. And so I actually looked into the two pathologies that I had not yet have experience. Now, I have experience with things like selective mutism. I've had 3 cases of selective mutism. That's rare, and I've had 3 cases. I've had familiarity cases with personality, multiple personality, dissociative disorders. 32 personalities ranging in age from 20 to 2 years old, living of both genders, living in this person, multiple personality from trauma and abuse. And so I've had experience in substance abuse and ADHD, school problems, autism spectrum, pretty much everything. So this was the last. There's 2 domains I didn't have. Family court, I hadn't worked there, and geriatrics, which is the other spectrum from my early childhood. But I know the brain, and it's the same brain, and it's decaying on the backside, and I know decay on the front side from all sorts of stuff. So so I took cases. I looked into both of those. I looked into geriatrics. Let's see what's up over here, and I looked into, because I was curious. I looked into um, the family courts. I accepted this Miners Council letter and sent in my vita, and that was the beginning. So she accepted me. I was a treatment provider for a family caught in the family courts, what you would call classically parental alienation. Now, I had never heard the term parental alienation. I had worked in psychology my entire career, from undergrad and suicide prevention center, master's degree, doctoral degree, all this stuff. My entire career was in clinical psychology, and I had never heard the term parental alienation because it doesn't exist. It doesn't exist except in the family courts. Anything that exists only in the family courts doesn't really exist. Okay, if something exists, it exists in the general population and shows up in the family courts, like personality, dark personalities, and the collapse into delusional thought disorders, and but it exists in the real world, and then it shows up in the family courts. But you gave yourself permission to make stuff up over there. The forensic psychologists gave themselves permission to make up a new quasi-judicial role, and then gave them permission to make up a new assessment approach for their new quasi-experimental role called the custody evaluation. It doesn't exist anywhere else in psychology. None of this does. They just made it up, and it's a failed experiment. And that's bad. But then we have the Gardner and his group just making up pathology because they think they can. And everybody says, no, you can't just make stuff up. And they say, yes, we can. And then they get fighting and conflict. For 40 years, you're fighting around this made-up pathology label. Does it exist? No. Delusional thought disorders exist. Factitious disorders exist. All this other stuff exists. So why don't you use it? I don't know. The forensic psychologists aren't using it. The Gardner people aren't using it. Nobody's using the actual DSM and actual real stuff. What's going on? So anyway, I took this one case, and I recognized it within the first session, because of my background in delusional. I met with the mom and the child. I look at the child and the relationship and what the child's saying. I'm saying that's a persecutory delusion. Okay, and so I'm looking at potentially a shared persecutory delusion, narcissistic, borderline dark personality. We didn't have darks back then, so we have narcissistic borderline. And I had a mom, so I'm looking at dad as the allied parent. So within 20 minutes, I pretty much had it, plus family systems, cross-generational coalition, and it was all clear, inverted hierarchy. So I had the diagnosis within 20 minutes, and then I kind of looked at the family relationship a little bit. Then my next session, number 2, was with the dad. I get the dad in there and pretty much confirm we got narcissistic with, interestingly, histrionic features. So it was narcissistic and histrionic features, and the persecutory delusion, persecutory thought disorder. Pop it out. So I got persecutory delusion there. I got persecutory delusion there. I got, factitious attachment pathology, and so I got my diagnosis at that point. And in DSM-4, it would be a shared psychotic disorder. And so it's actually in the DSM, shared delusional disorders in the DSM. So we were coming up, I was in the fall, we were coming up to Christmas, and all decided to take our Christmas break. And as we were coming into the Christmas break, here's the interesting thing. So I got my diagnosis in about 2 sessions, and then I started to not challenge the child and say, no, your mom's not abusive of you. That's like normal range parenting, and there's no problem here. And no, this is not real. And dad got wind of that because he's extracting information from the child after each session. So dad found out about that, and he went back to court and had himself inserted by court order into my therapy. What? And now I have a mother-child therapy in which I'm supposed to restore the relationship, and dad is sitting there monitoring that the child doesn't restore with mom. Are you kidding me? And that's why I say the court will absolutely destroy any attempt at therapy. So no clinical psychologists work here because the court doesn't listen. It just does whatever it wants to do, and it decimates therapy. So you won't get any doctors over here, and you won't get a treatment. So good luck with you in the family courts. So, but I'm a good clinical psychologist. Dad has himself inserted into therapy. So I'm not doing work with the kid. That's just going to triangulate, pull the kid apart. So I let the kid kind of sit there, and I just focused on the dad. Things like I wanted the kid to play a game with the mom. Yeah, that was my threshold. Just play a game, a card game here, with mom. Uno. Nope, I'm not going to play a game. No, I'm not playing with mom. Okay, so that's my little threshold. So I get dad in there. I said, Dad, he's a good kid, isn't he? Ain't Dad, yeah, he's a great kid. He listens to you. Oh, yeah, he listens to me. He's a great kid. Okay. All right, great. So, okay, let's get him to play a game with his mom here. And then I said, back with the instructions to Dad, get your child who's so cooperative with you, get him to play a game with mom. And Dad got like, well, play with your mom. And the kid goes, no. I'm looking because I changed the frame. Because before, when the kid rejected that game with the mom, that was like, because mom, I hate mom kind of thing. But now, rejecting that is dad's an incompetent parent. He can't, and the child didn't quite know what to do about that because their standard pattern is, no, I'm not playing with mom. But now dad's saying, play with mom, which is kind of their little ventriloquist thing. And then he goes, no, I don't want to. And dad goes, see, I can't. He has his own will and his own mind. But this case, I made it about dad's competence. And so when the kid starts to say, no, I'm not going to play with her. And dad says, well, and I say, wow, you're pretty incompetent as a parent. I use that word, the narcissistic injury. Wow, you're pretty incompetent as a parent. Look at this. The child is defying his mother. The child is defying the doctor. And now the child is absolutely defying you. This child's out of control. There's nobody that has control. And I'm just staying on the dad. And the kid's just listening to this. And the dad's getting, oh, I said, well, go ahead. If you're a competent parent, go ahead and make him play. Get him to play with a game with his mom. He cooperates with you. You told me he cooperates with you. He's a wonderful kid. He listens to you. So go ahead. And then, come on, play with your mom. And the kid was really interesting at that point. He's what? And he's going, I don't know what to do in this. And he stayed with the classic routine of, no, I don't want to play with my mom. Because that's what he does. That's what their pattern is. That's what they've rehearsed, kind of, dads were, and they've done this before. And this is a show they put on for the mental health people. So the kid stayed with the script of the show. And dad got pretty. So then the following session, we're heading into Christmas. The following session, I meet with the dad. And I say, Dad, here's my diagnosis. You're causing the pathology. Okay, it's a cross-generational coalition, and there's no problem with the mom, and he needs to bond into his mom. That's, mother-son. That's a really important attachment bond. And he's doing it because of your cross-generational coalition to you, his loyalty, and you don't like the mom and you want to punish him. So here's what's going to happen, Dad. We're going to come back from the Christmas break, and I'm going to want you to release the child from that situation, from the being caught in the middle. And if you don't release the child, I'm going to go back to minors counsel and say, Dad is causing the pathology, and the treatment's not going to work because Dad is creating the false pathology in the child. So I told the dad that before Christmas break. Now, over Christmas break, the dad takes the child to the emergency room because the child is having severe anxiety. The cause of the severe anxiety is Dr. Childress's therapy, and the child is supposedly having nightmares about Dr. Childress running over the child in his car. No, that's all factitious. That's all a false reporting. The child was actually kind of falling asleep in my session. At one point, Mom had to kind of say, wake up, because I wasn't paying attention to my child. I was focused on the dad, and we were doing dads because he put himself in my therapy. So I'm dealing with the dad. I'm not triangulating the child in. The child's not. So there's no stress on the child. But dad is creating a false anxiety disorder, takes the kid to the ER. The ER prescribes some sort of anxiety medication for the child, and the dad takes that back to and the ER therapist. Well, if he's having so anxiety about the therapist, maybe you should consider changing therapist. And so dad takes back to the court, gets the court to terminate my therapy with the child, and off they go. And so I never saw him again after the Christmas break. Oh no, you don't do that to my kid. So I contacted the minors council, and at that point I Googled factitious disorder. I started to look into factitious disorder imposed on another. It's a shared delusional disorder, and so I'm looking into DSM. So I Googled factitious disorder imposed on another to get up to speed on all the literature and everything. That would be Munchausen by proxy. Munchausen by proxy into Google, and parental alienation came up as one of the associated things because there was an article by Rand that mentioned possible Munchausen in this. And so boop, the two lined up. And so I went and looked at parental alienation. I said, oh my God, that's awful. Those symptoms of parental alienation, the 8 by Gardner, absolutely a nightmare. However, I read them and they're saying, well, if this is what they're using in the family courts, yeah, this fits. So I wrote to the minors council and said, this fits. Okay, so this is what's going on. Nothing. And I also said, this is what's going on from your term, but it's a factitious disorder imposed on another. And so I wrote to her saying, FDIA, that's child psychological abuse. Now, from where I come from, okay, Children's Hospital, if a physician is worried about Munchausen, factitious disorder, chart's really big, there's no medical cause for things, and they've ruled out the medical causes for the child's symptoms. You know what they do? They call down to the psych department and ask for a psych consult. And the psychology department sends up a pediatric psychologist, me, to make the diagnosis of a Munchausen by proxy, factitious disorder imposed on another. The physician doesn't make that diagnosis. The pediatric psychologist makes the diagnosis of FDIA. I, however, need to rely on the physician to have ruled out the medical causes. I'm not a medical doctor. But if they can rule out the medical doctor, so I'm called up on the consult, I say, is there a medical cause for this? They say, nope, we have pretty absolute certain, as close as we can get to certainty that there's no medical cause for that. Then I come in, apply the factitious criteria, interview people, look for the histrionic, look for the secondary gain, look for the false pathology, or the symptom features of that FDIA, and then I'll make the diagnosis. And that's an immediate child abuse diagnosis, medical child abuse. Boop, the child's removed from the care of the abusive parent. Standard in actual real world practice. I come over to family courts. I make the same diagnosis into the minors council, an attorney. Nothing. Just ignored. What? What the going on over here? And so I began to look into things more deeply and realized this parental alienation is a controversial thing. And I started to look and said, oh my goodness, nobody's doing anything about this. And that was my beginning entry and descent into the rabbit hole over here. So with that introduction, I'm now going to go off and start the rest of my day, and I'll pick up the next part of the story with what I did next, okay? Because you don't do that to one of my kids. Here's the thing about working with me, okay? I want every client child of mine to have the same quality of care that I would want for my son or my daughter, okay? So that's my standard. So every kid that comes into my practice is my kid. Okay, now I know you get to raise them. The parent gets to raise, but that's my kid. Okay, that's my son or my daughter. And so what level of care would I want the psychologist to provide for them? Well, if I've got a child abuse situation, the child's life is being destroyed, I want somebody to come in and protect my son or my daughter. Okay, the psychologist. And so you don't do that. No, you don't take the child out of my therapy and go off to abuse the child. That's my son. That's my daughter. No. So the fact that I'm still in the family courts is because I'm still working for that initial kid. Once we solve the situation in the family courts and we start protecting my kids, then I can go off back into ADHD and solve that. But no, you're abusing my children. You're abusing my son. You're abusing my daughter. All of my kids. And so, no, that's not okay. And so that's how I tumble down the rabbit hole into the family courts. Now, the next session, I'll tell you all about how what I did, what I'm doing, and we'll track the course of solutions in the family courts. So with that, I'm going to head off to the rest of my day, and good luck.